He had been walking home from his mother's house when it happened. A patrol car screeched to a halt beside him. No warning, no explanation, just an officer shouting to stop, eyes filled with assumptions. The man, Miguel, barely had time to raise his hands before the first blow landed. A baton across the shoulder, sharp and fast. He dropped his groceries. Avocados rolled into the gutter. No one intervened. No one asked questions. He was just another brown face in a hoodie, another suspect who didn't belong. Bruised but calm, Miguel didn't fight back. He gave his name softly. The officer laughed and said, "You people always got stories." The next morning, every officer in the precinct stood at attention for the arrival of their new commanding officer. The room fell silent as Miguel stepped through the door, crisp badge on his chest, healing bruise still faint on his jaw. Eyes locked, jaws dropped. The cop who hit him turned pale. The man he had assaulted wasn't just another face. He was now his boss. Miguel had returned to the city only a week earlier, though it felt like he had never really left. The streets still whispered the same sounds. The hiss of buses pulling to the curb, the distant echo of sirens bouncing between buildings, the shuffle of hurried footsteps on cracked sidewalks. He walked with purpose, but not in haste. The late afternoon sun warmed the pavement, and he carried a modest bag of groceries in one hand. Inside were simple things: tortillas, tomatoes, a bundle of cilantro, and a few ripe avocados. His mother had insisted he take them after lunch. "You need something fresh in that new fridge of yours," she had said, her hands fussing over his jacket like he was still 15. His clothes were plain. A dark hoodie, jeans, and work boots that had seen better years but still held strong. He looked like anyone else on that block. Tired, alert, anonymous. And maybe that was the problem. In this part of town, anonymity for a man with his face, his skin, and his posture often invited suspicion. It didn't matter that he had spent 15 years in law enforcement, had degrees framed and boxed in his new apartment, or that a new gold badge was waiting in a sealed envelope on his kitchen table. Here, in the open air of the city's south side, all that mattered was how he looked, and to some that meant trouble. He was halfway across the crosswalk on 14th and Maynard when the screech cut through the static of the evening. A patrol cruiser swung hard toward the curb, tires skipping slightly as the brakes fought inertia. The door flew open before the car even fully stopped. An officer, white, mid-30s, tall and broad, stepped out with his hand already hovering over his belt. His eyes locked on Miguel with a focus sharpened by assumption. Miguel stopped walking. He knew that stance, that energy. He had used it himself years ago in situations where instinct could either save or destroy a life. The officer barked something, sharp and fast. Miguel's hands instinctively rose halfway in that universal gesture meant to say, "I'm not a threat." But he didn't get the chance to speak. The officer closed the distance in 3 long strides and shoved him hard in the chest. Miguel staggered back, catching his heel on the edge of the curb. One of the avocados rolled from the grocery bag and split open on the sidewalk. The officer advanced again, shouting now, his voice a mixture of control and rising adrenaline. Miguel tried to identify himself, to explain, but the words caught in his throat as a sudden burst of pain erupted across his left shoulder. The baton had struck clean, hard, and practiced. Time slowed in the way it does when trauma mixes with disbelief. Miguel didn't fall. He didn't shout. He simply stood still, the weight of the blow grounding him, centering him. The officer's breathing was ragged now. He seemed confused by Miguel's calm, by the absence of resistance, by the complete lack of the usual narrative he had come to expect from this script. Miguel spoke then. One sentence. Quiet. Clear. The name he gave wasn't one the officer recognized. Not yet. The commotion had drawn attention. A few bystanders stood frozen, unsure whether to pull out their phones or walk away. No one intervened. The officer radioed something hastily, but it lacked urgency. He wasn't arresting Miguel. There was no charge, just an assertion of dominance, a performance of control. He walked back to his cruiser without apology, leaving Miguel to gather his groceries from the pavement, one by one. Miguel didn't report the incident. Not immediately. He knew the city too well, knew how such reports became bureaucratic burdens instead of justice. He walked the rest of the way home in silence, one hand pressed to his bruised shoulder, the other gripping the now crushed bag of food. When he reached his apartment, he opened the envelope on his table. Inside was the official offer of promotion, Chief of the 17th District, effective Monday. He sat down and read the letter 3 times. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in the top drawer of his desk. He didn't need to stare at it. He had already memorized every word. That night, he lay in bed staring at the ceiling fan, listening to the city breathe outside his window. He thought about the officer's face. The badge number he had read instinctively burned into memory. He didn't feel anger. Not yet. Just clarity. The system he was about to lead was cracked at its foundation, and he had just felt it under his skin. In the morning, he would shave, dress in full uniform, and walk into a precinct where his name was on the wall. But tonight, he let the silence stretch long and heavy, like the space between lightning and thunder. A warning, a beginning, a reckoning already in motion. Morning arrived with a quiet intensity. The city stirred beneath a low gray sky, and the streets carried the hum of routine. Commuters in motion, storefronts opening, sirens in the distance fading into the background of normal life. Miguel stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the collar of his uniform with practiced precision. The fabric was stiff and newly pressed, the weight of the badge heavier than he remembered. This uniform didn't just represent authority. Today, it marked a line in his life, a crossing from silence into visibility. He buttoned the last clasp on his shirt, smoothed the creases on his sleeves, and looked himself in the eyes, not seeking confidence, but checking for readiness. What he saw staring back wasn't pride or fear. It was resolve. He arrived at the precinct 15 minutes early. The parking lot was already half full, lined with cruisers and unmarked vehicles. Their lights off but their engines still warm. The building was familiar yet foreign, a place where he had once walked the halls as a junior officer, now re-entered with a title that would demand deference. Inside, the air carried the scent of coffee and floor polish, the usual tension of a law enforcement office before shift change. A receptionist glanced up from her desk and did a double-take before stammering a quick good morning. He returned the greeting with a nod and moved toward the elevator. The moment the doors opened onto the 3rd floor, the tone changed. Conversations paused. Heads turned. A few officers straightened their postures. Others merely stared, trying to connect the face with the name they had heard but never seen. Miguel walked calmly, his boots echoing off the tile, past the break room, past the hallway lined with commendation plaques, until he reached the glass door bearing his new title, Commanding Officer, 17th District. The door was unlocked as he'd requested, and the office beyond it still smelled of new paint and recently delivered furniture. He stepped inside, placed his cap on the coat rack, and stood by the window. From that vantage point, he could see part of the block where the incident had happened. Just 3 days ago, he had stood there as a stranger, stripped of authority, judged on sight. Now, from this elevated view, he could see every corner, every intersection, and he understood the burden of perspective. Authority from above meant nothing if it didn't reach the ground. He didn't want distance. He wanted impact, but that would require more than directives. It would require confrontation. The officer who had assaulted him, he had reviewed the file that morning. Officer Daniel Haskins, 10 years on the force, clean record, commended for community policing though the record lacked detail. Miguel remembered the face with clarity. He had already scheduled a staff-wide briefing. Everyone would attend. No exceptions. Haskins would be there. He would see him, not in handcuffs, not in shame, but standing at the front of the room, wearing the bars of a superior officer. When the time came, the precinct's main hall filled quickly. Officers filed in, some murmuring to one another, others glancing at the agenda taped near the door. Introduction of Commanding Officer. No one knew exactly what to expect. The city had announced the appointment with a short press release and little internal fanfare. A few knew Miguel's name from past cases, whispers of his time in special investigations, his temporary transfer to internal affairs. But few had seen him in action. Fewer still expected what was about to walk through the door. He entered with a quiet command. No loud announcement, no dramatic pause. Just the sound of his footsteps and the hush that followed them. He stepped up to the front of the room and scanned the crowd. He didn't look for one face in particular. He let them all see him. Let them all register who was now leading them. And when he spoke, his voice was firm, deliberate, and free of pretense. He told them about expectations, respect, integrity, community accountability. He spoke about trust, not as a buzzword but as the foundation they had a duty to rebuild. He didn't name the incident. He didn't recount the assault. But every word carried its shadow. He said there would be changes. New oversight protocols, increased engagement with underrepresented neighborhoods, a mandatory review of use of force incidents. He made it clear that no badge was above reflection. Not even his own. Some nodded. Others stiffened. And one, toward the back, shifted uncomfortably, his eyes dark and jaw tight. Miguel didn't focus on him. He let the message speak first. Let the discomfort settle. He wasn't there to humiliate. He was there to redefine. After the meeting, some officers approached to offer greetings, guarded handshakes, polite welcomes. Others avoided eye contact. Miguel accepted it all with composure. This was not a victory lap. It was the beginning of a long excavation. Later that day, as he reviewed incident reports in his office, there was a knock at the door. Officer Haskins stepped in, posture tight, eyes cautious. Miguel gestured for him to sit. The air between them was thick with unspoken history. Haskins said he wanted to apologize. Miguel listened. Every word another stone laid in a path toward accountability. The apology wasn't elaborate. It didn't need to be. What mattered was that it happened. In that room, on record, witnessed by the man who now held the authority to end or extend his career. Miguel told him he would be placed under temporary observation, partnered with a senior officer known for de-escalation. He wouldn't be punished, not yet, but he would be watched closely. His conduct moving forward would determine his future. Haskins nodded, lips pressed tight. He understood. That evening, the precinct felt different. Not quieter, but clearer. Miguel stood again by the window, watching the same block where it all began. The same sirens echoed. The same faces passed. But the man behind the glass was no longer just watching. He was shaping, and he had only just begun. The first few weeks under Miguel's command passed with the controlled pace of recalibration. The precinct had been used to a rhythm governed by routine and hierarchy, a culture where tradition often overpowered change. Now, small shifts were taking place, subtle at first but undeniable. Miguel wasn't interested in sweeping declarations. He believed in systems, in observation, in steady pressure applied where it counted. So he watched. He walked the halls without warning, entered squad meetings unannounced, and made a habit of reviewing body camera footage without waiting for complaints to arise. Not to police his officers, but to understand them. He began each morning with roll call, standing shoulder to shoulder with his team, not above them but among them. He asked for updates, but more importantly, he asked for observations, what they were seeing on the streets, what was changing, what was being missed. At first, the officers answered stiffly, offering only what they thought he wanted to hear. But slowly, trust began to form, not with everyone, but with enough to matter. A younger officer, fresh from the academy, shared how some residents hesitated to speak during wellness checks. Another mentioned a landlord in a low-income complex who was exploiting tenants but slipping past legal boundaries. Miguel took notes, always, not just mental ones but written. It showed them he listened, and soon they began to speak more freely. In parallel, he began inviting community leaders into the building. Clergy, local business owners, school administrators, organizers who had once protested outside the very walls he now governed. He brought them into the briefing room, not as symbolic gestures but as consultants. He gave them time to speak, asked for their grievances, and challenged them to offer solutions. The officers were required to attend. Some rolled their eyes. Others crossed their arms and leaned back in their chairs. But Miguel made it clear, this was no longer a precinct where only one side of the story mattered. Outside the building, Miguel returned often to the neighborhood where the incident had occurred. Not to confront, not to correct, but to reconnect. He visited the grocery store where the confrontation had begun, walking the aisles with a quiet familiarity. Some of the same employees were still there. One recognized him. Her eyes widened in surprised recognition, followed by something softer, respect. Miguel nodded, picked up a bundle of cilantro from the same produce section where his groceries had once spilled across the floor, and moved on. The moment required no words. He started walking beats with patrol officers, rotating his time between day and night shifts. It unsettled some of them. Few had ever worked beside their commander in real time. Miguel didn't announce these patrols. He simply showed up, wearing the same uniform, carrying the same gear, stepping into cruisers like it was the first year on the job. On one such patrol, he and a senior officer responded to a domestic dispute call in a tight-knit apartment complex. The situation was volatile. A shouting match, an unstable tenant with a history of noncompliance. Miguel stayed back at first, allowing the responding officer to lead. But when tensions rose, when voices climbed and hands began to twitch at belts, Miguel stepped in. Not as a superior, but as a peer with experience. He de-escalated with words, body language, and presence. The moment dissolved. No one hurt, no arrests needed. The resident thanked them through tears. The officer beside Miguel said nothing during the drive back, but his silence was thoughtful. Haskins remained under observation, paired with a new partner who documented every shift. Miguel watched his performance reports closely. The aggression had softened. The tone of his interactions showed signs of self-regulation. He made fewer stops, but more of them ended in resolution rather than escalation. Miguel didn't speak to him directly unless necessary. He wanted the lesson to marinate, not as punishment but as reflection. Back at the precinct, one of Miguel's newest initiatives began to take root. An anonymous reporting system for internal misconduct. Officers could log observations of inappropriate behavior without fear of retaliation. The idea was controversial. Some viewed it as a betrayal, a tool for cowardly whispers, but others embraced it. Within 2 weeks, a report came through about a veteran officer repeatedly mocking residents in immigrant-heavy neighborhoods. Miguel read it, verified its legitimacy through ride-along footage, and summoned the officer for a private meeting. The response was defensive, angry, dismissive. Miguel didn't argue. He presented the evidence and outlined a mandatory cultural training program. Completion would be monitored. Refusal meant reassignment. Resistance came, but it came quietly. He knew not everyone would support his methods. Some officers remained cold, clinging to old mentalities like lifeboats on a sinking ship. But Miguel had not come to be liked. He had come to lead. His background didn't shield him, it demanded more of him. There was no room for error, no tolerance for contradiction. Every move he made was watched, every decision dissected. But he welcomed it. Transparency was not a threat, it was armor. At home, the evenings remained still. He kept his apartment sparse. One photo of his parents on the wall. A map of the city above his desk, dotted with pushpins marking high contact zones, unsolved incidents, and areas where community trust was lowest. He studied it like others might study war strategy, not to dominate, but to understand the battlefield. He didn't want conquest. He wanted change. One night, he reread a report submitted by Haskins's partner. It detailed a stop where a teenager had been detained briefly for suspicious behavior near a closed storefront. The partner noted that Haskins had led the interaction calmly, avoided force, and de-escalated when the boy's brother arrived. Miguel sat back in his chair, the page resting on his knee. It wasn't redemption. Not yet. But it was a seed. As he turned off the lights and prepared for sleep, Miguel knew the transformation he was pushing would be slow, uncomfortable, and often resisted. But it was necessary. Because power only meant something if it served the people who had once been powerless. And he had not forgotten what it felt like to stand on the pavement, hands raised, dignity bruised. Now he had a badge that could protect others from that same fate. And he intended to use it. By the time Miguel had spent 2 full months as the new commander of the 17th District, the atmosphere inside the precinct had changed in ways both subtle and undeniable. The long-standing officers, the ones who had grown used to the comfort of unchecked autonomy, now walked with a touch more awareness. The newer recruits, once quiet and wary, had begun to ask more questions, speak more freely, and raise concerns they might have previously kept to themselves. Miguel hadn't forced respect, he had cultivated it. Through presence. Through listening. Through consistency. And now, the results were beginning to show not just in reports and numbers, but in the faces of the people both inside and outside the walls of the station. The weekly community meetings he had instituted were no longer awkward gatherings with half-empty chairs. Word had spread that this chief actually listened, that when someone spoke about harassment or mistreatment or fear, he didn't respond with excuses. He responded with action. He'd follow up. He'd send officers to check on cases, investigate ignored complaints, and most importantly, circle back to the people who had trusted him enough to speak. People who had once viewed the badge as a symbol of fear now began to see possibility. And yet, Miguel remained cautious. Change was fragile. One mistake, one incident could undo weeks of progress. So he paid attention to every detail, every beat, every call that ended strangely, every officer who filed reports too neatly. He tracked trends and noticed when stops increased near schools or when certain zip codes saw spikes in patrols without cause. His background in data analysis, honed during his time in internal affairs, proved invaluable. But it wasn't about numbers for him, it was about behavior. One afternoon, a call came in about a suspected robbery in a high-traffic commercial corridor. 2 young men, both Latino, had been spotted running from a convenience store with backpacks. A witness claimed they saw something suspicious. Officers responded quickly. Miguel was already on his way before dispatch finished relaying the call. Not because he doubted his team, but because he had learned that his presence often de-escalated tension before it could turn to headlines. When he arrived, the scene was already active. 2 patrol cruisers, flashing lights, a small crowd forming. The boys were seated on the curb, not in cuffs, but under watch. Miguel parked his vehicle, adjusted his jacket, and approached. He didn't issue commands. He asked quiet questions. It turned out the boys were running late to a community soccer game and had stopped to buy snacks. The clerk, recognizing them as regulars, confirmed they paid. The witness had assumed. That assumption had nearly become a record. Miguel spoke with the officers not to embarrass them, but to highlight what could have gone differently. The boys were released, the crowd dispersed, and Miguel waited until everyone had gone before leaving himself. Later that evening, he called their parents personally. Not to apologize on behalf of the system, but to assure them that someone inside it cared enough to be accountable. Word of this incident spread just like the one months before had. But this time, the narrative was different. The man in the badge hadn't escalated, he had defused. He hadn't vanished after it was over, he had followed through. And people began to talk about the 17th differently. Not perfectly, but differently. Back at the precinct, Miguel met with the training division to overhaul their bias response protocols. He implemented scenario-based simulations with actors from the community, people who knew the subtle ways judgment creeps into a stop, a search, a conversation. Officers resisted at first. Some called it political. Others said it made them hesitant. Miguel told them hesitation wasn't weakness, it was awareness. And awareness could save lives. Meanwhile, Haskins continued to work under close supervision. He no longer moved with the swagger he had once carried. His voice had quieted. His eyes scanned situations more carefully. Miguel observed from afar. He wasn't interested in shaming the man, he wanted transformation. On one occasion, Miguel saw Haskins assist a homeless veteran suffering a mental health episode outside a subway station. Instead of shouting or grabbing, Haskins crouched, listened, and called for a social worker. The man accepted help. No arrest. No force. Just human interaction. It was small, but powerful. These moments began stacking, quiet indicators of a culture in shift. And yet, Miguel knew better than to declare victory. Every system resists change. Power always pushes back. One morning, he found an anonymous note left on his desk. No name. Just a message: not everyone wants your kind in charge. The handwriting was shaky, rushed. It wasn't the first time he had faced prejudice. It wouldn't be the last. He didn't report it. He didn't investigate. Instead, he placed it in his drawer next to the promotion letter he had kept all this time. One as a reminder of what he had earned, the other of what he still had to fight. Later that week, during a departmental town hall, Miguel stood before his full staff. He spoke not of rules or punishments, but of legacy. He asked them what kind of department they wanted to leave behind, what kind of stories they wanted kids in the neighborhood to tell about them. He didn't shout. He didn't lecture. He simply made them look at themselves and ask if the badge they wore reflected who they believed they were. After the meeting, several officers approached him. One asked to transfer to the community engagement unit. Another asked if she could help teach the de-escalation course. A third, one who had never spoken more than a word to Miguel, simply nodded and said, "I've got your back." It wasn't revolution, but it was change. Miguel returned to his office that night as the sun dipped low over the city skyline. He stood by the window watching the streets below. People moving, laughing, struggling, surviving. He thought of how easy it was for power to crush or to carry. And he reminded himself that every decision he made could be the difference between dignity and despair for someone who looked like him. He turned off the lights, locked the door, and walked out not as a man in charge, but as a man still fighting to prove why he should be. It was a Thursday afternoon when Miguel received the invitation. A citywide leadership summit was being organized by the mayor's office, meant to gather department heads, school administrators, nonprofit organizers, and law enforcement leadership under one roof to discuss urban development and public trust. It wasn't uncommon for police leadership to be invited to such events. But Miguel knew the weight of his presence would carry a different energy. He wasn't just another officer in a suit. He was a symbol of change, of conflict, and of challenge. The agenda listed him as a featured panelist under the category Trust in Uniform. He didn't flinch. He accepted immediately. He spent the days leading up to the summit continuing his rounds through the district, staying visible not because of ego but because visibility was accountability. He sat in on youth programs, walked school hallways with local officers, and spoke at a small library gathering about the importance of conflict resolution between teens and authority figures. These weren't press opportunities. There were no cameras, no applause. But they were necessary. Each one chipped away at years of neglect and hostility that couldn't be erased with slogans or speeches. The morning of the summit arrived under a bright, clear sky. The event was held at a downtown civic center, a glass-paneled building surrounded by flags and lined with security. Miguel arrived early, not to prepare but to observe. He watched as department heads with polished shoes and practiced smiles filed into the auditorium. He noticed who shook hands with whom, who avoided eye contact with uniforms, and who seemed to treat the event like a performance. He had seen this culture before: polished intentions, polished statements, and very little follow-through. When it was his turn to speak, he stepped onto the stage without notes. The moderator introduced him with a carefully worded summary of his recent appointment and his work to build bridges between police and underserved communities. Miguel stood before the crowd, let the silence settle for a moment, and then spoke plainly. He talked about the night he had been mistaken for a suspect, about how quickly force was used without evidence, about how little space there was for people like him to make mistakes or even be misunderstood. He didn't name the officer. He didn't shame the department. He simply laid out the facts. And then he shifted to the work. He described the changes implemented under his leadership, the accountability measures, the training initiatives, the community partnerships. But he didn't paint them as victories. He framed them as obligations, overdue and fragile. He told the crowd that trust couldn't be restored through optics. It had to be rebuilt through discomfort, through confrontation, through admitting failure. There were no standing ovations. Just a heavy stillness, the kind that comes when people are forced to see something they can't unsee. After the panel, several attendees approached him. Some thanked him. Others asked for meetings. One nonprofit director, a Latino woman who ran a youth diversion program, invited him to visit their facility. Miguel agreed without hesitation. He knew these connections mattered, not just for perception but for strategy. Building alliances outside the precinct was part of his mission. Because the future of policing wasn't just about who wore the badge, it was about who had a seat at the table when decisions were made. Back at the precinct that evening, he found a small envelope in his mailbox. Inside was a card and signed. It read, "You're making more enemies than friends." There was no return address, no handwriting to trace. Miguel folded the note in half and placed it in his desk drawer beside the others. He didn't show it to anyone. He didn't react. These were reminders, not threats. Reminders that the ground he was standing on was still shifting, still dangerous. The following week brought another layer of complexity. A video surfaced online, grainy cell phone footage of a young black man being detained outside a liquor store by two officers from a neighboring precinct. The interaction grew tense. The man was unarmed. The officers raised their voices. The crowd grew. Someone shouted that he hadn't done anything. The man was eventually let go, but the video ended with a frame of him holding his hands up, eyes wide with fear. The incident didn't fall under Miguel's jurisdiction, but it fell under his conscience. He called a press briefing not to distance his department, but to draw a line. He stated clearly that accountability should be standard, not reactionary. He offered support to the man involved, and he invited the community to submit feedback on his department's practices. That night, some praised his leadership. Others accused him of posturing. Miguel didn't respond to either. He simply continued the work. The next day, a familiar figure walked into the precinct, Officer Haskins. His face had lost the defensive edge it once carried. He requested a meeting. Miguel granted it. In his office, Haskins shared that he had been reflecting on his actions more deeply than he ever expected. He spoke of discomfort of realizing how easily bias had clouded his judgment. He didn't make excuses. He made an offer. He wanted to help train new recruits on what not to do, what he had done. He said he didn't want his mistake to repeat itself through another pair of hands. Miguel studied him carefully. The room was silent. No judgment passed between them, only time. Then finally, Miguel agreed. Haskins would assist with the next academy cycle, not as a lecturer, but as a cautionary voice. Redemption wasn't guaranteed, but this was a step, one Miguel believed in. Because leadership to him was not about punishment. It was about possibility. That night, alone in his office, Miguel stood by the window again. The city glowed beneath him, neon and blurred. He thought about how the same streets could be seen through two different windscreens, the one from a patrol car hunting for problems and the one from a storefront watching hope walk past. He wanted his officers to see the second one more often. He wanted his legacy to be defined not by how he wore the badge, but by how he redefined what it meant. 3 months into his command, Miguel stood at the heart of a precinct that had begun to beat with a new rhythm. Change didn't announce itself with banners or applause. It whispered through slow shifts, through the reduction in unnecessary stops, through the rise in community-led initiatives, through the emails from residents who once spoke with fear now offering ideas, observations, and, occasionally, gratitude. Yet Miguel remained cautious. The work was never finished, especially when that work was as fragile and volatile as rebuilding trust in a system that had shattered it countless times. He knew victories in policing weren't always measured in arrests or press conferences. They were measured in what didn't happen, escalations avoided, biases interrupted, voices heard instead of silenced. Inside the walls of the precinct, the culture continued to evolve. Officers who had once rolled their eyes at training sessions now volunteered to lead them. Patrol units paired with outreach workers in areas historically marred by tension. Miguel implemented a mentorship track where younger officers were matched not just with veterans but with civilians, respected figures from neighborhoods they would serve. It was unconventional and at first resisted, but soon the results spoke louder than doubt. Empathy had always been the missing link. Now, Miguel was trying to institutionalize it. He maintained his schedule of walk-alongs and unannounced visits. He remained visible in neighborhoods others avoided and continued to quietly correct behaviors inside the force that threatened to undo the progress they were making. When necessary, he made tough decisions. One officer was suspended for repeated infractions related to language used during stops. Another was quietly transferred after failing to comply with de-escalation protocols. Miguel didn't celebrate these moves. They were not triumphs. They were necessary protections for the community and for the standard he had sworn to uphold. Outside, the public's perception of the 17th was shifting. At a local high school, Miguel was invited to speak during a civics class. When he walked in, some students looked skeptical, others indifferent. But by the end of the hour, hands were raised, stories shared, one student even asking how to apply to the Youth Advisory Council he had quietly launched 2 weeks prior. He left the classroom not with the illusion of full trust, but with a sense that the conversation had changed. People were finally speaking to the badge, not just around it. It was in this fragile momentum that something unexpected occurred. A journalist, freelance, independent, but respected, reached out requesting to shadow Miguel for a feature on modern policing leadership. Miguel hesitated. He knew the risks. Publicity could distort. Narratives could be hijacked. But he also knew the power of transparency. He agreed, under one condition: there would be no pre-approved questions, no staged scenes. What she saw is what she could write. Over the course of 3 days, she followed him through his routines. She observed his morning briefings, his conversations with staff, his interactions on the street. She saw him break up a shouting match between 2 store owners without ever raising his voice. She watched him mediate an internal dispute between officers from rival shifts, allowing both men to speak, then leaving them with a question instead of a verdict. How do you want this place to remember you? The article published 2 weeks later under the title The Badge and the Burden. It was neither a glowing profile nor a hit piece. It was balanced, textured, and deeply human. It acknowledged his flaws, his struggles, his critics. But it also painted him as a man truly trying, to reshape a foundation with cracks older than his own career. The response was swift. Calls from other districts, inquiries from city leaders, even a private message from a neighboring police chief asking to meet. Miguel accepted the ones that mattered, declined the ones that didn't. He had no time for politics disguised as progress. In the midst of this, Miguel received word that a public ceremony was being held at City Hall honoring leadership across agencies. His name was on the list. He didn't care for ceremonies, but he went quietly, respectfully. When he arrived, suited officials greeted him with polite applause. As he took the stage to receive the plaque, his eyes scanned the crowd and locked onto a familiar face near the back. It was the officer who had once struck him. Haskins. No longer hiding behind defensiveness or fear. Just watching. Present. Silent. After the event, Miguel stepped into the sunlight outside the building. The city spread out before him, messy, flawed, and beautiful. He walked past people who didn't know his name, past corners where he had once been judged, and toward a future he was still building with every step. Change wasn't loud. It didn't declare itself complete. It moved like him, slow, deliberate, persistent. That evening, as the precinct quieted and officers clocked out, Miguel remained at his desk. He reopened the top drawer and pulled out the folded note he had never thrown away. The one with the words, "You don't belong here." He read it one last time, then calmly fed it into the shredder beside his desk. The next morning, he arrived before sunrise, brewed coffee for the entire team, unlocked the doors, turned on the lights, and welcomed everyone because he did belong here. And now they all knew it.